In this screencast, our group will be arguing that despite the short-term issues sparked by World War, the constant state of conflict China endured to try to maintain power over its own country was a long-term effect that was the primary cause for the Chinese Civil War.
My name is Julia Christensen, and I was looking at spheres of influence as one of the long-term causes of the Chinese Civil War. There were several main countries that had been influencing and controlling China long before the Chinese Civil War, which created conflict and problems in China that ultimately led to war. The first country was America. Washington helped the nationalists by providing them with the money and resources that were available to, which caused anger with the communists. Concerning the Soviet Union, Stalin caused issues with the nationalists when he sent in supplies and troops to help. And these issues all added up to the Chinese Civil War.
Hi, my name is Emily Groken. I'm going to be talking about the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars were two separate conflicts between Great Britain and China that centered around the legalization of opium trade in China, China against Great Britain for. The first war took place in 1839 and ended in 1842 with the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. This ceded land to Great Britain as well as set up treaty ports in cities like Shanghai. Additionally, the Second Opium War started in 1856 and ended in 1860. Short-term effects of this were the expansion of the coolie trade, expansion of the legalization of opium trade, and the exemption of foreign imports from internal transit duties. Now, there were a lot more long-term effects that contributed to the Chinese Civil War, such as the economic impact it had. So China had to make payments to Great Britain after both wars, which severely weakened its economy, and it created large amounts of easily created rebellions. Politically, the immigrants had an easier time getting into China after the wars, and so they formed expatriate communities instead of cities, which contributed to a lack of patriotism and national identity. And it is also considered this led to the Sino-Japanese Wars. Socially, the production and trade of opium legalized in the Treaty of Nanking led to 27% of Chinese males being addicted to opium.
Hi, this is Taylor, and I'm going to be discussing the First Sino-Japanese War. The First Sino-Japanese War commenced in 1894 and lasted until 1895. Prior to the war, both nations were gaining power, Japan due to being influenced by the ideologies of the nations in the West, and China because of all the transformations from farming to manufacturing produce. The war began due to China and Japan arguing over which nation would take power over Korea. In the end, Japan brought troops into Shandong, China in 1895, and eventually Japan took the victory over China. There was a peace agreement made at the end of the war known as the Treaty of Shamongi, where Korea was no longer under any nation's control. Japan gained the right to use areas of China that China does trading on, and China surrendered Taiwan as well as parts of Manchuria. Since China lost to the war, the strong nations of Western Europe were starting to try to adjust the government system in place in China, and the people of China were starting to rebel against the monarchy government in place. The effect of the First Sino-Japanese War on the Chinese Civil War was that the civilians of China were seeking for a change of government and system, and ultimately led to the collapse of the Qing dynasty system. The collapse of that government system led to the political parties creating two systems of government, the Chinese Communist Party and the Guangdong. These were the two parties that were the conflict of the Chinese Civil War. The Sino-Japanese War falls under the political category of PEMS because the war led to a change in the system of government in place in China. The Sino-Japanese War falls under the military category of PEMS because the success of the Japanese in the war was due to their navy beating the Chinese navy, which gave them power over the sea and an advantage over the Chinese that led to their victory.
John Sklenar. Missionaries came to the country of China in 1803 and lasted until 1957. However, missionaries started to die down after a group in the summer of 1900, where the majority of missionaries in China were Protestant, and they began to become killed by a group called Boxers. This was because these groups found, and the people of China found that the Manchu dynasty was a very impure thing for China, as well as Western influences. So the emperors forced the idea that it is because of Western influence that all of this is happening. So these Boxers massacred all these missionaries, people that came from Western influence, and it created this hate um, in China towards Western influence. And the people of China began to create a power struggle with the Western countries. And now, during the Chinese Civil War, there's a lot of debate of whether they should follow this Western influence or whether not, to whether follow the ideas of communism, which is not a Western influence, or whether to go with Western influences and have a more nationalist ideology.
I'm Connor McRoy, and I'll be discussing the Boxer Rebellion in China. The Boxers were comprised mostly of young peasants who believed that their spiritual and religious practices made them invincible to battle, even to things like bullets. The purpose of the rebellion was to try and rid China and Beijing from foreign influence, from things like the government buildings to Catholicism and those who practiced it. Foreign countries and missionaries were, for many years, extending their influence further and further into China, and the rebellion was the first major manifestation by the Chinese of their disapproval. The Boxers' first attack spanned about a week, and they destroyed many foreign offices and burned Catholic churches, while murdering Christians and foreign representatives. Countries like Britain and France responded by sending a small force over to China to deal with the Boxers, which they did with relative ease due to the Boxers' refusal to use Western weaponry like guns. Tens of thousands of Boxers were killed, with few casualties on the side of the Westerners, and the engagements were more like massacres rather than battles. The rebellion just gave foreigners and Catholic missionaries more of a reason to stay and extend their influence, now knowing that China had no real way to get rid of them. The rebellion brought China to the realization that their old customs and ways were outdated and that they need to change in order to regain control of their own country.
This is Katie Urban, and my topic was Dowager Cixi. Empress Dowager Cixi was the primary political leader of the Qing dynasty. During the Boxer Rebellion, Cixi was accused of personally encouraging the slaughtering of foreigners and Chinese Christians. She was also later blamed for the invasion/occupation by Western nations. Many considered Dowager Cixi as the person responsible for the fall of the Qing dynasty. Yet there are some who argue that Cixi was only reacting to events happening around her instead of egging on the situations. This is because Cixi refused to adopt Western ideals and ways of government, but she did support technological advances and military reform. That was until the Second Opium War, when China found out its military tactics were outdated. Cixi then began a sort of learn from foreigners campaign in which China adopted Western industry. This was a moment in which a prominent leader of China let Western influence affect the nation, something that the Chinese Civil War was all about. Without Dowager Cixi's decision to adopt Western industry into China in order to compete with the West, Western influence would have been a slightly lessened presence in China.
Fu Yi was born in 1906 when China was under the Qing dynasty. But 2 years after his birth, Fu Yi's uncle would die of arsenic poisoning, transferring the throne to Fu Yi, thus the emperor. Fu Yi was unaware of the revolutionary turmoils that had taken place within his motherland, as he grew up in Japan for the majority of his life, and was primarily influenced by the Japanese in his decision-making. Fu Yi's rule was formally ended on February 12, 1912. However, control was volatile over the years. In July 1917, a warlord named Zhang Sun would return the throne to Fu Yi for a mere 11 days to be taken by Daun Quiri. The Japanese would give Fu Yi control of Manchuria, captured in 1931, to continue using him as a puppet. The impact of Fu Yi's rule lay in the fact that he lacked any true authority by the time he was the age to make meaningful decisions. He had already lost control of China, and all other responsibilities were under strict supervision of the Japanese. Fu Yi marks the point in which the Chinese government became a puppet state. Consequently, there's something notable about being the last emperor of the Qing dynasty and last emperor of China. Furthermore, he would be the last emperor before the Chinese Civil War, and this photo was be used symbolically to fuel the revolution.
In 1999, Yuan Shikai was appointed governor of the Shandong province, and later, in 1901, promoted to a significant figure in China. Yuan Shikai refused to aid or support the Boxer Rebellion and suppressed them with his new army troops. After the Boxer Rebellion, Shikai strongly supported the new policies being implemented after the signing of the Boxer Protocol in 1901. In 1903, he began to lead the Beiyang army and would later be in charge of setting up industrial and mining establishments, railways, a police force, and new-style universities, and he eventually abolished the time-honored imperial examination. Yuan Shikai became the prime minister in 1911. Sun Yat-sen became the president and later promised that he would give up the position for Shikai if Pu Yi were to abdicate the throne. Shikai forced Yi to abdicate the throne, and Shikai became the president of the Republic of China, which ended the Qing dynasty. Yuan Shikai was the president who signed the 21 Treaty of Japan after months of negotiations. Yuan Shikai was less of a political leader and more of a military-based leader, as he was a very powerful and respected military figure in China.
James Klein. The Bianyang Army was formed from what was originally the Huai Army, led by Li Hongzhang in the late 1800s. This army was untraditional for the Chinese in the way that it was more modern on the ranking system. As opposed to using traditional Chinese method of age, experience, and familial bias, it was largely based on individual actions. The army gradually grew throughout the late 1800s to eventually become the largest militia in China by the mid-1890s, and fighting the majority of the First Sino-Japanese War on the Chinese side. After Li Hongzhang's passing in 1901, Yuan Shikai rose to power to take Hongyang's spot. Shikai proved to be very effective in his time, maintaining the army's reputation as the best in China. When the Qing dynasty took control in 1909, they attempted to remove Shikai from power to replace him. The officers in the army stayed loyal to Shikai, only listening to his orders. Shikai would lead his forces during the Chinese Revolution and eventually become the Emperor of Japan. After his ascent to emperor, there were issues with the army and the Kuomintang as Shikai wanted to keep them separate. Shikai was at this point the one man who was able to keep the army together and functioning. When he died in 1916, the army separated into 3 different parts in different regions, all controlled by different warlords. This is one of the main causes of the outbreak of the warlord era in China. Because their largest and most powerful army was now ruled by warlords, it created a power struggle for the military in China during the 1920s. When the Chinese Civil War broke out, the Kuomintang came after the different warlords and their private armies. Some were convinced to join the Kuomintang in fighting against the communists, and the others were killed or their armies were defeated. The Bianyang Army demonstrates a power struggle as a component to the outbreak of the Chinese Civil War, as it is an example of a military power struggle in China which prohibited the unionization of one government and one military. Thus, it is a reason for development in the Chinese Civil War.
Hi, this is Isabel, and I will be discussing the Wuchang Uprising, or the 1911 Revolution. Prior to the 1911 Revolution, there was a lot of unrest with the Qing government after the Chinese defeat in the Opium Wars and the Sino-Japanese War, which helped to set stage for a revolution. Sun Yat-sen was the revolutionary leader. He supported Western ideas and formed the Revived China Society, which aimed at overthrowing the king and establishing a republican government. The revolution started by accident. On October 9, 1911, a revolutionary group in Wuhan accidentally set off an explosion while making bombs, and in order to avoid arrest, they began a revolt, and they were actually fairly successful and able to take control of most of southern China. While this was a military conflict, it had a strong political effect. Sun was elected president and then proclaimed the Republic of China in 1912. The king was still in charge of the north, but Sun offered the presidency to Yuan Shikai, who was the leader, if he promised to support the republic, and Yuan accepted and then moved the government to Beijing. Sun eventually rose to power again and made Chiang Kai-shek a military leader, who took his place after Sun's death. This event is very important in the case of the Chinese Civil War because it eventually led to Chiang's rule, and as we know, that led to the weakening of the nationalists and the conflict between the nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party.
I'm Tara Collier, and I will be looking at how the fall of the Qing dynasty is a long-term cause of the Chinese Civil War.
The fall of the Qing dynasty marked the end of China's imperial history, which dates back to 221 BC. The Qing dynasty held power from 1644 to 1912, and the last 70 years of it is considered to be a long story of decline. The struggle for power and eventual decline of the dynasty was caused by both external and internal factors. The most devastating external factor was the Opium Wars, which resulted in Britain taking over Hong Kong, showing the world that China had become weak. With the world knowing its weakness, China began to lose its outer regions that it could not protect as well. By 1900, foreign governments had taken over all of China's border regions, which took a severe amount of power away from the imperial system. Just like the external struggles, China had a lot of internal factors that resulted in the collapse of the Qing dynasty. To begin, the empress of the time purged in her court
those to be considered modernizers. Without modernizing the nation, China did not stand a chance against the foreign powers. Chinese peasants began an anti-foreigner movement in 1900, however they had little power over the foreign governments. After this, the dynasty only lasted one more decade before collapsing and marking the end of China's imperial period. The fall of the dynasty left China broken, and internally they needed structure and power. Government parties such as the GMD and the Chinese Communist Party rose following the years of the fall of imperialism, which inevitably would end in a power struggle.
The National Protection War was a very socially influenced historical event and took place only 3 years after the Qing dynasty was overthrown and replaced by the Republic of China. It was a civil war that was caused by Yuan Shikai declaring himself the emperor. At the time, Shikai was the leader of the republic. Shortly after, Kai Yi declared independence in the Yunnan province capital, Kunming. The leader of the nationalists was Sun Yat-sen. The first major problem he came across was that even among the nationalists, he was not favored by everyone. Public opinion was generally split between the two. As a result, the fight against Yuan was mainly led by the Southwest, so they formed the National Protection Army. However, the leaders of this army did not support Sun, but rather were very divided among political parties. But there was still much support for Yuan, which threatened the small and poor National Protection Army. To counter this, the army established an alternate form of government to Beijing, which consisted of military officials from the army. Lu Rongting was the most powerful member of this army. They grew in power very quickly and put great amounts of pressure on Yuan, so much so that he was forced to leave the empire, allowing the National Liberation Army to take over. This signified the beginning of a long separation between northern and southern parts of China. This also signified the start of the warlord era, which lasted until 1928, showing it was a very significant long-term event that led to the Chinese Civil War.
Genworth. The 21 demands were presented by Hoki Eki, the Japanese minister, to the president of China, Yuan Shikai, on January 18, 1915. These demands were intended to be a secret ultimatum with the threat of war looming if they were not agreed upon by China. The ultimatum of military action in China from Japan was given on May 7, 1915. Japan understood China's weakness in letting other countries control their decisions and their actions by having small pieces of land or small pieces of control within their country going a long time back, making this a long-term cause, even though it was short-term decision made at the start of World War I. The demands were broken up into 5 groups. Groups 1 through 4 were not as influential because they only renewed or granted renewed concessions or granted new agreements or trade agreements. For example, territorial trade or rail concessions in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia. These did not have overall control over Chinese politics or sovereignty. Group 5, however, was a large threat to China's national sovereignty because it forced China to consult with Japan for major decisions and forced them to hire political officials of Japan origin. Overall, the term is considered political because it deals with political power in China, but it also incorporates a little bit of military with the ultimatum threat.
This is Riley, and the Kuomintang were also known as the GMD, or the Nationalists of the Chinese Civil War era, which was led by Chiang Kai-shek, who fought against the Chinese Communist Party. Before Chiang, the leader was Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and he wrote the 3 Principles of the People, in which these principles translate into nationalism, democracy, and the people's welfare, which shaped the Kuomintang ideology. The power struggle between the nationalists and the communists was a reason why there was a Chinese Civil War, hence why it was known as a civil war, because it is 2 sides of a country fighting against each other. However, there was no room for compromise due to the fact that these 2 political parties were just too power-hungry and too different. The Kuomintang mostly had support from the rich, while the Chinese Communist Party had support from the majority of China, which were peasants and workers. During times in which the party needed to be strong, Chiang Kai-shek chose to focus on the military, which then led to thousands of compromises with local power holders, corruption within the system, and inflation, which ultimately led to a failure.